Welcome everyone to another Simulate Cybersecurity broadcast. This one is going to be so cool, so wonderful. We're talking about Cyber Essentials, Mark, a great start for better cyber resiliency in Asia. You think about Asia and all the booming businesses there and the challenge of cybersecurity. Asia has never experienced more business impacting cybersecurity threats than any other time. Right? It's just the way it is these days. 56% of small to medium businesses in the region have suffered a cyber attack in the last 12 months. 84% of the businesses feel exposed to cyber threats, and we're going to talk about it today. And this is awesome. And I'm joined with the one and only Dr. Magda Chelly. How are you doing?
Hi, Dave. I'm very good. Thank you very much. It's
Awesome.
a pleasure to be here.
It's awesome to have you. It's awesome to have you. And there is a blog post that goes along with this broadcast. And I'll put this in the notes section of the video here. And in fact, I think I could go ahead and chat with everyone and put this here. And there it is. So you can see the URL to get the blog post as well. So Magda, in looking at this, which is it's a Singapore framework and guidelines. However, what's important is we'll get into how it affects people in Singapore. At the same time, it's a beautiful holistic look and framework look that could be used across all of Asia, right? So even though we're going to talk about this from a Singapore perspective and a standard there, it's also important outside, and it can be used to help people sit there and assess their cyber readiness and things like that, which is really kind of important. In talking about this, let's talk about what is the origin of this standard.
Well, I would say, Dave, let's take a step back and understand that Asia is a very fragmented market. We have different countries with different regulations and different maturities. And I always keep on repeating that because it's essential to understand it. The reason behind it is obviously when you have different level of maturities, you end up as a company collaborating with various suppliers, partners, clients, especially in this region, that might have a different level of cybersecurity measures and controls. That in itself might open possible risks to your organization, to your employees, and therefore lead to eventually either the compromise of your organization or directly even the compromise of the whole supply chain between you and the different partners, clients within the region. Now, of course, this means that we would imagine that those companies will put in place certain security measures, at least the basic hygienes, in order to ensure that the security or the protection of their data and critical systems is in place. Well, unfortunately, reality shows that there's still a lot of lack of awareness and maturity, especially within the small and medium enterprises. This is not only specific to Singapore, this is the reality across the world. I want to say actually that is not specific to this region, but in particular as well in this region. And why is that? It is specifically for few reasons, but I will start with the first one, the lack of return on investment. We keep on talking about that. And of course, it's very hard to understand how much a business will get back if they invest in costs related to cybersecurity. But the other second reason is the lack of understanding of how a cyber attack or a data breach, or both, might affect a small, medium business or enterprise. By the way, SME is very common in Singapore. It's not the SMBs, which is very often used as well in the States. So, and in Europe. So just to make sure, when we're talking about SMEs here, we're talking about small and medium enterprises.
Gotcha.
Now, just to finish on this introduction that, puts the context and explains a little bit the environment, is that when we have this lack of visibility of return on investment, plus a lack of understanding of the consequences of the business, we are actually facing a very hard time to make sure that companies, especially the smaller ones with limited resources and budget, adopt cybersecurity measures. And I think this topic is the main reason why it's also important for countries and for regulators to actually step in and eventually start trying to build guidelines and support for example, frameworks as well as certification to entitle and encourage those companies to put in place at least the cyber hygiene measures or framework security controls.
Very good. And what's interesting is, along with this new framework, starting October of this year, which again is about 2 weeks away, in Singapore itself, there's some heavy duty fines going on for breaches if you're found not to be cyber secure or having the right kind of hygiene. You want to talk about that a bit? It's really kind of interesting.
I think we see in Singapore an increasing interest around raising the awareness, as I mentioned, but also ensuring that companies understand data responsibilities and obligations. So, for example, the Privacy Act in Singapore has recently been updated, and now if a company is facing a data breach, they might face a fine up to 10% of their revenue, or 1 million Singapore dollars in fines, whichever is higher. And I do believe that this is not only very similar to what we see with the European GDPR, but as well, it actually pushes companies to understand that it's really important to protect personal data, that there is actually consequences, or there are consequences of not doing so. And the first step is very often to impose fines if the due care is not there in place.
Right. And beyond the fines, I think what's important, you talked about trying to understand the return on investment. The challenge, I think, that in talking to professionals all the time is a lot of times are astonished that they feel like they're not the target, right? They're too small to be a target. But yet all of us are so dependent on IT today in every business. So there's times where someone will say, I'm making goods and services totally unrelated to anything high tech. But then when they have a breach, they realize, oh my God, I can't create invoices. My manufacturing machines are down. I can't call my suppliers or vendors. And they find out that tragically, their business is so impacted by cyber events.
Absolutely. And I would add here as well that when we target specifically the small businesses, right, or even medium businesses, and we look at how cybersecurity might affect their operations, their even market share, we really need to address it much more from the business perspective. So often I hear, yeah, so I have a data breach, so what? And literally the question is, so what? If my personal data is there, my address, my phone number, even today, I still hear that. Now, let me take a very practical example. You are a small business owner. You actually work in a particular niche. You're providing, you're driving your business, you're building your pipeline, and then suddenly all your pipeline with confidential pricing and contracts is breached. Someone has access to your email and has access to all this confidential information, which means that someone is able actually to steal from you, your customers, and eventually even your leads with better offers, with a better approach, with perhaps a better products as well. So there are other consequences than just the identity theft, which can happen. Like, for example, especially financial consequences can be very heavy in the US, someone opening a bank account and a loan in your name. Here, for example, in Singapore specifically, it might be much, much harder to do so, even if your personal information is leaked. However, still, there are other consequences. There can be physical harm to you. We never know. There's no place in this world that doesn't have, crime zero. So you imagine, for example, your information is somewhere on the internet, and then you travel or you go somewhere, and then you actually find yourself exposed to physical harm because someone is maybe following you, someone knows exactly every single activities that you're undertaking. So again, when a data breach or a cyber attack happens, because of our dependency on technology, we are not anymore talking about, just a small identity theft. And I'm actually, especially and specifically on purpose, using that as, a little bit of, I would say, trying to make it not a basically relevant to the audience, right? Because they believe that the consequences sometimes of that identity theft might not be that big. So I'm doing it on purpose. Of course, an identity theft is really a big challenge, and it can be very harmful to the individual, and it can be very challenging to fix it. But that's the perception of the current audience, especially when we talk about the small businesses. And last point that I would like to mention as well, which is very relevant to the small and medium businesses, is that comparing to other bigger companies where you have the resources, you have the right support in case of data breach or cybersecurity attack, small companies might not have the capabilities to recover properly from this data breach or a cyber attack. And that might lead to really disastrous consequences. In some cases, even the closure of the businesses. And statistics show that 60% of small and medium businesses close doors after 6 months following a cyber attack. So those are statistics. And the reason being is not because directly of the cyber attack itself, it's because of the consequences that cyber attack means to the business. And those consequences, as I mentioned, can be just way beyond what we usually or traditionally imagine as just a consumer or a user of internet services.
That's amazing. That's an amazing statistic. When you think about that. So you go from the concept of people needing to understand the risk has real consequences, whether it be the fines or business continuity, right? Losing your business, losing everything, right? Because of cyber threats and cyber crime. The next thing is then, okay, so how are we going to handle this, right? So we have this new Cyber Essentials mark. And how do we let people understand that this is adoptable? It is digestible. They can do this. It is possible. What are some of the things that we could talk about this that make them understand that?
So, Dave, I think there is a very important point here that we need to realize that, first of all, risk can never be completely mitigated.
Correct.
There will be always residual risk, right? Now, the question is, with that residual risk, are you able to recover or limit the impact of that risk if it happens? And the Cyber Essentials mark is actually providing a framework of baseline security controls and is intended to protect organizations against the most common cyber attacks. Now, this has been launched by the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, and it is in addition, or actually there is an additional other framework for a more mature organizations that's called Cyber Trust Mark, and this helps really to have a cybersecurity risk framework that not only takes in consideration the resources and maturity, but as well that provides very clear categories and baselines to put in place. So again, just to recap, there are two. There's the Cyber Essentials mark and the Cyber Trust. We're going to focus on the Cyber Essentials mark today, which actually has 5 categories. And those categories, I want to actually just mention that they should be there for every single business, because if you don't even have them at all, it's basically like leaving the door of your house open and asking for the, for the thieves to come in. So I really want to make that very clear.
Magda, I'm imagining the sign in Vegas. You see the Viva Las Vegas sign with the lights and the arrow. Enter here. Welcome, criminals.
Exactly.
It's very true. And what's interesting, so a little bit about the study and the standard is what in looking at this myself and reviewing this, it's quite impressive. It's quite comprehensive. At the same time, it can be easily done, right? And they provide you a self-assessment Excel. There's certification bodies that'll help you go through. It's inexpensive, where the fines, if you fail during a cyber breach, are pretty high, as we talked about. In this situation here, we're talking about a few hundred Singapore dollars at that to get the certification. And for people outside of Singapore, you can actually download the spreadsheet and take a look at it and just see what it entails. But the point is that it's actually very palatable for people within Singapore to get it. and also leads to discounted insurance rates, which I thought was interesting. So let's talk about the different 5 components of this framework and why they're important, what we have.
Absolutely. So first of all, the most important category is assets. And we talk about cybersecurity. You need to protect yourself. You need to ensure that you have the right security controls, but you can't protect what you don't see or you don't know that you have. So it's very important to understand what are the assets that you need to protect as a business, as a company. And that starts from people. So your people, your employees, your shareholders, even your board members, depending on the company structure. Hardware and software, and hardware as well, needs to be protected. So you need to know exactly what hardware and software you are using. And data. Data is very, very critical. You need to know exactly what data is important to you in order to ensure that you put in place the right measures. Now, I want to take a step back on this first category because, reality shows that very, very, very often companies do not have a very good inventory of assets.
No,
that's
usually the worst thing. No, it's usually the worst thing. They don't have, correct, very correct. Yeah.
So, but the point is, if you don't have at all versus you have at least made the effort, then you are still reducing your risks. So now, for all the companies that are listening today that don't have anything, start by just thinking what tools are you using. Oh, I'm using, for example, Microsoft Office. I'm using an antivirus. I'm using Amazon. I'm using an accounting tool, etc. Start writing them down, or at least have a very clear picture of what tool you're using. Otherwise, you cannot move to the next step, which is understanding what data you're storing where. So it's not only about the data. Oh, I'm storing, for example, just professional data. I'm not storing personal data. This also happens often. So data or assets that relates to data are not only data that you exchange with customers. So especially around SMEs, when I trained some companies, I had the question about, but we don't have personal data of the customers, because under the PDPA, professional data that relates to, for example, whatever is on your business cards, it's not within the scope. So, but I look to the companies and I tell them, but do you have employees? Do you store their banking account details? Do you store their personal address? Those are personal data. And
Yes.
now that means that you making sure that your inventory of data is correct requires you really looking at all those points in much more details to ensure that you don't miss any of those points. Now, this is the first category, and it's really, really critical and very important for the businesses to start with. Otherwise, you're protecting something without really knowing what you're protecting. It's like, I'm closing the door of my house, but I'm leaving the other door open because I forgot and I didn't remember that I had very good valuable on the balcony, for example. So having that visibility and clarity, what's important to me, it's the first and really critical step. The second step, of course, when you have that visibility, is to start protecting those assets. And protection is, in this cyber essentials mark, is simplified to actually 3 main subcategories. Virus and malware protection, very commonly known in this SME world, right? I have an antivirus, I'm protected, all is good. Well, here we go. If you have it, that you're already a step closer to the certification. But that's not all. Access control, so meaning that you need to know who and how you are accessing to that data or assets that you need to protect. For example, the password is an access control, but that's not enough to protect the company. You need, an account, especially nowadays. The most common that we recommend as cybersecurity professionals is the 2-factor authentication, right? So you actually make it harder for the cyber criminals to break in. And I'm saying harder, not impossible. And then secure configuration, which is making sure that your settings are put in place properly. And here, I want to give the example of Facebook or, LinkedIn, which are social media that very often in Asia are used for business as well. Facebook as well, depending on your industry. So now in Facebook or in LinkedIn, you have settings, you have privacy and security settings. You, as a business user, you need to update them. You need to put them in place. And that applies for most of the digital assets or tools that you're using or hardware. You need to configure them. So the second category is secure protect, which actually includes those three subcategories: virus and malware protection, access control, secure configuration. Now, the third category, which is...
Before we go to the third category, the key here too is what's also neat about the standard is as time goes on, sources of secure configuration will be available, right? There are ways that you could find out, for example, let's say I'm dealing with cloud controls and you may not have the expertise in-house. The idea is that with this standard, you'll be able to go somewhere and say, what is a good example of a secure configuration for my AWS cloud, for my server, for my application, things like that as well, which is going to be critical, which will help you get through these kind of things. Very good.
Absolutely. And so, of course, especially when it comes to secure configuration, I think there's the whole topic about it. So we can discuss it for, hours, because with the adoption of the cloud, it becomes a very, very critical step. Otherwise, again, you are basically exposed immediately. Some of the cloud service providers services have very granular settings and configurations that you need to enable. Otherwise, you again are immediately leaving the door open to cyber criminals.
And the other thing before we move on to the next category, too, so we've talked about assets, we've talked about secure protect, is the fact that you talked about a house, but it's also the village. And the idea is today, most businesses are interconnected. You may have a supplier who automates getting you new parts for something that are inside your IT environment, right? You may have customers who you talk with and confer with. If you automate the automation on getting them new gear and stuff like that, or whatever your services are, is that you also, when you think about the assets and secure and protect, you have to understand what are these other openings into other environments and entities as well.
Absolutely. I think we do not still, as a whole, as a community and society, understand how much we are dependent on each other or in the digital space. Literally what we call the supply chain, the digital supply chain, is very complex nowadays. And every time you take on a new tool, every time you're using a new technology, you're actually expanding it. So we're not working in silo, we're working in an ecosystem. And that ecosystem, imagine every part of it has those exposures and should actually put in place the cybersecurity baseline controls, at least. That's the minimum. So there's a kind of impact that can go really, really far. And I had a very interesting question one time where someone asked me, can the internet go down? Because of that, right? And the answer was like worldwide, right? And the answer was, oh, it's not that easy. But in theory, if you look at it, yeah, of course, there are a lot of security measures. But in theory, if those security measures are not put in place or there are mistakes in there, we might get in a situation where that doesn't work, or at least a specific part of the internet doesn't work. I really like that question because the research around it shows a very fundamental point. If the providers have not worked together to ensure that the security measures, including redundancy, very strong backup systems, are not in place, we wouldn't be even able to use the internet as smoothly as we are today. Correct. So everything that we are doing today is, again, interdependent, but as well raising that importance of the security measures. And I think this is, I mean, some of the aspects, and I thought that it would be really interesting to share that question.
I like that one. So we have Secure Protect, which is, we have Secure Protect. We have the idea of the assets. So assets and Secure Protect. What is the next thing?
The next thing, which is very critical, is the updates. So the third category is software updates. And of course, we're talking about patching in cybersecurity very often. And I realize as well, from a small business perspective or a small business owner, when you say patching, what does it mean? Do I patch the walls of my house? You patch the walls of your digital ecosystem. And that's how we can make the analogy. You won't leave a hole in your wall. You need to ensure that you patch your software, your hardware. And that basically means security updates. Now, the security updates sometimes are available by the vendors and you need to go and check them out. Sometimes you might actually allow your software to be updated automatically. It really depends on your settings as well. And this is a topic not only that is extremely critical, but it's also, it can be complex the more bigger the company becomes, because of course you have updates that can fail, you have updates that are not that easy to implement because you break things. But let's take a step back. We hear very often, for example, this news saying to you, oh, Apple is launching a new update. You need to update your mobile phone, because there are some security vulnerabilities, where that's a reason, a very good practical example. The reason why you need to update your iPhone, for example, is because there might be security updates, security fixes, or security patches. So this is the third category. And I'm conscious of time, so I want to just as well address the next one, which is the fourth one, backups. Yes. And I will not spend too much time on it because backups are, I would say, a topic that is more familiar with the small and medium companies, I believe. The only difference is that, of course, backups require the organization to consider nowadays that, for example, in the case of certain attacks like ransomware, which is a ransom malware, you need to ensure that your backup is protected from that. For example, you have a hard disk that is offline. This is an example. Now, it's a little bit more complicated, but backups are really important, even for personal usage. If you lose, for example, your laptop, then you cannot recover all your family pictures, for example. Imagine if you lose your laptop from a business and you cannot recover all your confidential documents. Now, the same happens if your laptop or your network gets attacked and then your files are encrypted and you have no way to get access to those files anymore. And encrypted, in most of the cases, means that you need a specific key to read the data. You just want to clarify that, which is also a term that might not be very familiar.
Very good. And the final one, and then we'll get some more conversations here, is response, which is about incident response. And again, depending on the size of the company, that means different things, but it's really kind of critical.
Yeah, Dave, and I think the response part is a part or a category that requires much more awareness and more talk about it, especially in the small and medium enterprise world. Why? Because whatever we talked about, whatever we mentioned, the categories, protect, secure, updates and configurations, the backup, it's still a fact that 100% security does not exist.
Correct.
The only way to ensure your business sustainability, longevity, is by having the right incident response in place, being able to understand what can happen and how you can recover from there in a timely manner. First of all, even being aware that something has happened. I think many companies, especially the smaller ones, might have been compromised and are not even aware that someone is reading their emails every day. Is that paranoia? No, it's not. It can happen because if you don't have the right measures to detect a suspicious activity, you cannot respond and you cannot take the measures to stop that suspicious activity from happening. So I think the category response is a very, very critical one. And it's a matter of understanding how to detect, again, as I mentioned, which means that you need to have alerts in place, need to understand how to activate them. And this, let's be very, very pragmatic or practical. You have tools or mail providers like Gmail, Yahoo, Microsoft Office. The most common are used by SMEs. They all provide you alerts in place. You can activate them. So if there is, for example, someone trying to access your account, you get notified, so you can take the right measure to stop that from happening, or being just aware that someone is actually targeting you. If you don't have those alerts, you will never know.
I can't tell you how many times I've worked with customers and we started a new cybersecurity project where we just began to do something different, whether it be adding software-based segmentation, adding a dynamic deception honeypot, going in and adding some new security controls. I'm talking not fully implemented, but just putting them out there to begin with. Many times we've been able to detect attacks and stop them from reaching that point of criticalness and damage and duration because we began to do something. And I think that's really kind of critical for people. Is there's no silver bullet in cybersecurity, but you know what? There's a phrase: God helps those who help themselves. If you help yourself, right, you're going to find out that the damage and duration is minimized in most situations, right? There's no guarantee, but that just beginning to do this makes such a world of difference between total tragedy and recovering gracefully.
Absolutely. And I think, this is very nice, leading to the point that there's not only no 100% security, but as well, we as humans, we make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
So often we don't realize how important it is to test. You need to check what are the security controls that you have in place and how are they working, or are they even working at all? Like I have this several cases where, the tool was implemented there, both by the company, but it actually wasn't configured. So sorry, if you have a tool that you buy, but you don't configure it, it won't actually work, or it might not work at all. So I think the testing of your implementations, of your configuration, is the next holistic point. After, you have the categories implemented, you're able to understand that you have the baseline, you need to check it. It's like an audit, but a practical one. And the audit is something that, and I'm sorry for anyone who is from the audit. I don't mean to be, but there's a lot of checklists, right? We need to be more practical. Cyber criminals are not reviewing an Excel file. They're actually trying to get in. So when they try to get in, you really need to make sure that you have a clear understanding if your security controls, configurations have been implemented and done properly. Not because you don't trust your team or you don't trust your supplier or IT manager, because people make mistakes, even a simple fact like that.
Yes. And today that's so common. I mean, the idea is that attackers change all the time what they're doing. And our enterprises are so dynamic. They're so fluid because things change all the time. New vulnerabilities are used all the time. You need to be able to test in environments to make sure things are configured the way they're supposed to be and that they're working appropriately, which is key. Excellent. Very cool. That's a great conversation here. A lot of good information here. You have the URL to the standard as well as to the blog post that Magda wrote. Magda, thank you for joining me again. This is so awesome. This was a great explanation and truly appreciate you. Will you come back?
Thank you so much, Dave. It's always a pleasure to discuss with you. And I really hope that the audience will enjoy a further overview of the Cyber Essentials Mark. And I hope they will start their journey to put in place what is not only good to have, but mandatory to have in today's world where everything is digital.
Amen. On that note, thank you, everyone. This is a Simulate Cybersecurity broadcast. Thank you. See you next time.